The notification came through at 3:47 a.m., lighting up my phone screen in the darkness of what used to be our bedroom. Insufficient funds, transaction declined. I blinked at the message, still groggy from sleep, certain I must be misreading it. Our joint checking account had contained over $48,000 when I'd checked it yesterday afternoon. Now, according to the automated alert from Midwest National Bank, we were overdrawn by $17.32. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hand trembled as I opened the banking app, squinting against the harsh light. The transaction history made my blood run cold. Transfer to external account $15,000. Transfer to external account $15,000. Transfer to external account $18,000. All initiated at 2:15 a.m. All authorized with Marcus's credentials. The savings account showed the same story. The investment account we'd built over 7 years of marriage. Cleaned out. Even the emergency fund we kept in a separate high-yield account, the one we'd sworn only to touch if one of us ended up in the hospital. Gone. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs as I reached for the empty space beside me. Marcus hadn't come home last night. He'd said he was working late at his family's distribution center, preparing for some important supplier meeting. But as I stared at our decimated finances, I realized he hadn't been preparing for a meeting. He'd been preparing for an escape. My name is Nina Reeves, and until 12 hours ago I thought I had a solid marriage to Marcus Brennan, heir to Brennan Logistics, one of the most successful regional distribution companies in the Midwest. We'd been together for 7 years, married for 5, and I'd spent most of that time not just supporting his role in the family business, but actively transforming it from a struggling operation into a thriving enterprise. What Marcus didn't know as he drained our accounts and disappeared into the night was that I'd been keeping my own secrets. Secrets that would make his betrayal the biggest mistake of his life. I met Marcus at a supply chain management conference in Minneapolis when I was 28, and he was 31. I'd just completed my MBA with a specialization in operations management, and was working as a consultant for struggling logistics company. He was there representing Brennan Logistics, though representing might be too generous a term. He spent most of the conference at the hotel bar, charming other attendees with stories about his family's business, while showing remarkably little interest in the actual educational session. I found him intriguing despite myself. Marcus had that particular brand of confidence that came from growing up wealthy, coupled with just enough self-deprecating humor to make him seem approachable. He was handsome in that prep school way, with sandy brown hair that looked professionally tousled and clothes that whispered expensive without shouting it. When he approached me during the networking reception, I was prepared to brush him off as another entitled heir coasting on family achievements. Instead, he surprised me. "Nina Reeves," he said, reading my name tag with a smile that seemed genuinely delighted. "I sat in on your presentation about supply chain optimization for mid-sized distributors. The algorithm you developed for road efficiency was brilliant. I'd love to talk to you about potentially implementing something similar at our company." The fact that he'd attended my presentation and actually paid attention earned him a conversation. The fact that he listened thoughtfully to my responses and asked intelligent follow-up questions earned him my business card. When he called 3 days later to schedule a formal consultation, I thought I was gaining a valuable client. I had no idea I was meeting my future husband. Brennan Logistics was a mess when I first toured their facility. The company had been founded by Marcus's grandfather in 1962, and had grown through a combination of strategic acquisitions and sheer stubbornness. By the time I arrived, they were operating out of 3 warehouses spread across Wisconsin, using systems that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, and hemorrhaging money on inefficient routing and inventory management. Marcus's father, Richard Brennan, greeted me with barely concealed skepticism when Marcus introduced me as their new consultant. At 63, Richard was old school in every sense of the term. He believed in handshake deals, paper ledgers as backups, and the idea that technology was more trouble than it was worth. His wife, Diane, who served as the company's CFO despite having no formal financial training, was slightly more welcoming but equally set in her ways. The rest of the family was rounded out by Marcus's younger brother Kyle, who managed fleet operations with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rather be anywhere else, and his sister Jessica, who handled human resources when she wasn't busy with her true passion, real estate speculation. It was clear from day one that Brennan Logistics was less a professional operation and more a family employment program. My initial contract was for 3 months. I was supposed to analyze their operations and provide recommendations for improvement. What I actually did was completely revolutionize how they did business. I implemented new routing software that cut delivery times by 30%. I restructured their warehouse layouts to improve picking efficiency. I negotiated better rates with suppliers and identified redundancies that were costing them hundreds of thousands annually. Marcus was my liaison with the family, and we spent countless hours together reviewing data, testing new systems, and strategizing implementation. He had a sharp mind when he chose to apply it, and I found myself enjoying our working sessions more than I cared to admit. He was also refreshingly honest about his family's limitations. My father built this company through sheer force of will, he told me one evening as we worked late in the conference room, but he never adapted to modern business practices. He still thinks email is a fad. My mother means well, but she learned accounting from library books in the 70s. Kyle would rather be racing cars, and Jessica treats the company like her personal ATM for real estate ventures. And you? I asked, curious about how he saw his own role. He laughed, but there was something rueful in it. I'm the one who's supposed to take over eventually. The heir apparent, except I've never been given any real responsibility or authority. I'm 31 years old, and I still need my father's signature for any purchase over $5,000. That vulnerability, that admission of frustration, made me see him as more than just another privileged heir. I began to understand that beneath the confident exterior was someone who felt trapped by family expectations and limited by outdated traditions. When he asked me to dinner after our contract ended, ostensibly to celebrate the successful implementation of my recommendations, I said yes. Our relationship progressed quickly. Marcus was attentive, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in learning from my expertise. He asked about my background, my education, my career goals. He introduced me to his business contacts and spoke proudly of my achievement. When challenges arose at Brennan Logistics, he called me for advice, valuing my opinion even though I was no longer officially consulting for them. 6 months after we started dating, the company faced a crisis. Their biggest client, a regional grocery chain, was threatening to end their contract due to repeated delivery delays and inventory errors. Richard was panicking, Diane was in denial, and the siblings were pointing fingers at each other. Marcus called me, desperation clear in his voice. Nina, I know you're not our consultant anymore, but we need help. This client represents 30% of our revenue. If we lose them, we might have to close one of the warehouses, lay off dozens of employees. My father's talking about selling the company at a loss, just to avoid bankruptcy. I agreed to help, partly because I cared about Marcus, and partly because I couldn't stand to see a salvageable business fail due to poor management. What started as emergency assistance turned into a complete operational overhaul. I worked 16-hour days for 3 weeks, coordinating with the client, restructuring delivery schedules, and implementing quality control measures that should have been in place years ago. Not only did we keep the client, but they increased their contract by 20%, impressed by the rapid improvements. Richard actually shook my hand and thanked me, which Marcus said was the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in Brennan family recognition. That night, as we celebrated with champagne in Marcus's apartment, he got down on one knee. Nina Reeves, he said, pulling out a beautiful vintage ring, you saved my family's business. You've made me believe that Brennan Logistics could actually have a future worth building. More importantly, you've made me believe in myself. Will you marry me? I said yes, caught up in the romance of the moment and genuinely believing we could build something amazing together. What I didn't realize was that I'd just agreed to marry into a family that would spend the next 5 years taking credit for my work while systematically excluding me from any real recognition or authority. The warning signs were there from the beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But I was too in love and too confident in my abilities to pay proper attention. The first red flag came during wedding planning when Diane insisted on introducing me at family gatherings as Marcus's fiancée who helps out with the business sometimes. When I gently corrected her, explaining that I'd essentially rebuilt their operational systems, she'd pat my hand and say how nice it was that young women today had such interesting hobbies. Richard was worse in his own way. During our engagement party, he gave a toast, thanking Marcus for his vision in modernizing the company and bringing Brennan Logistics into the 21st century. No mention of who had actually done the modernizing. When business associates complimented the company's turnaround, Richard would nod toward Marcus and say the boy finally found his calling, as if Marcus had single-handedly orchestrated the transformation. I told myself it didn't matter. I knew the truth, Marcus knew the truth, and the results spoke for themselves. After we married, I officially joined Brennan Logistics as Director of Operations, a title that sounded impressive but came with surprisingly little actual authority. Every decision had to be approved by Rich. Every innovation had to be presented as Marcus's idea to be taken seriously. Every success was attributed to Brennan leadership, while every setback was somehow related to the growing pains of implementing my systems. The financial arrangement was equally frustrating. Despite my crucial role in the company's success, my salary was a fraction of what any male family member earned. When I brought this up to Marcus, he promised to talk to his father about it, but months would pass with no changes. "We'll fix it after Dad retires," became his constant refrain. "Once I'm officially in charge, you'll be properly compensated for everything you do." I supplemented our income through private consulting work, building a reputation in the logistics industry that was entirely separate from Brennan operations. This moonlighting, as Richard dismissively called it, actually earned more than my official salary. I maintained separate professional accounts for this work, a decision that would prove fortunate given what was to come. The real shift in our marriage began about 3 years in, when Brennan Logistics landed a massive contract with Preston Manufacturing, a deal that would double our revenue overnight. I'd spent 6 months preparing the proposal, analyzing Preston's needs, and developing customized solutions that set us apart from larger competitors. The presentation itself was a masterpiece of data-driven persuasion and strategic vision. But when it came time for the actual pitch meeting, Richard insisted that Marcus lead the presentation. "A family member needs to be the face of the company," he explained, as if I hadn't married into the family years ago. I sat in the back of the room, watching Marcus deliver the presentation I'd created, stumbling over technical terms, and deflecting detailed questions with promises to follow up later. We won the contract anyway because the work spoke for itself, but the credit went entirely to Mark. The local business journal ran a feature story titled, "Marcus Brennan, the Next Generation of Logistics Leadership." The article mentioned me once, in the final paragraph, as Marcus's wife who assists with operational matters. That night, I confronted Marcus about the article. He was defensive in a way I'd never seen before. "What was I supposed to do, Nina? Tell the reporter that my wife actually runs everything? How would that look for the company, for my father, for me?" "It would look like the truth," I replied, feeling something fundamental shift between us. He softened then, apologizing and promising again that things would be different once the leadership transition happened. But I was beginning to realize that the transition was a moving target, always just a few years away, always contingent on some other milestone being reached first. Meanwhile, my actual contributions to the company continued to grow. I developed a proprietary inventory management system that reduced waste by 40%. I negotiated partnerships with technology providers that modernized our tracking capability. I created training programs that transformed our workforce from resistant skeptics to efficiency enthusiasts. And through it all, I watched the Brennan family take credit for innovations they couldn't even explain if pressed for detail. Kyle was perhaps the most blatant in his appropriation of my work. During board meetings with outside investors, he would present my fleet optimization strategies as his own initiatives, reading from notes I'd prepared while adding just enough masculine bravado to make them seem like his idea. When I privately confronted him, he laughed it off. "Come on, Nina. You know how it is. No one's going to take fleet management seriously if they think a woman designed it. I'm doing you a favor by being the face of it." Jessica was subtler but equally problematic. She would reframe my employee development programs as her own HR innovations, always careful to thank me for my input in a way that minimized my actual role. During one particularly galling incident, she accepted an industry award for our revolutionary approach to warehouse staff retention, a program I'd developed from scratch after extensive research and testing, but it was Diane who perfected the art of erasure. As CFO, she had final say over budget allocations, and somehow my department always faced cuts while Marcus's vague business development initiatives received unlimited funding. When I presented financial projections showing how my operational improvements had increased profit margins, she would acknowledge the numbers while attributing the success to improved family leadership and traditional Brennan values. The isolation wasn't just professional. Family gatherings became exercises in subtle dismissal. At Thanksgiving dinners, my opinions on business matters were politely ignored while Jessica's husband, who worked in insurance, was treated as a font of wisdom. During Christmas parties, I was inevitably grouped with the other wives for conversations about recipes and home decorating, while the men discussed strategy and Richard's study. Marcus seemed oblivious to these dynamics, or perhaps he chose to be. When I tried to discuss how marginalized I felt, he would minimize my concerns. "You're being too sensitive, Nina. My family loves you, they just show it differently than you're used to. Give it time." I gave it 5 years, watching my innovations transform Brennan Logistics from a struggling regional player to a thriving multi-state operation. Revenue increased by 300%. Employee satisfaction scores went from abysmal to industry lead. We won awards for operational excellence, supply chain innovation, and sustainable practices. And through it all, I remained Marcus's wife, who helps out sometimes. The breaking point came 6 months ago when Richard announced his plans for succession. After 40 years at the helm, he was finally ready to step back and let the next generation take over. The family gathered for a special dinner at the Brennan estate to discuss the transition. I arrived expecting Marcus to finally receive the authority we'd been waiting for, which would theoretically allow him to recognize my contributions and restructure the company to reflect reality. Instead, Richard announced that he was dividing leadership among all 3 siblings. Marcus would be CEO, but Kyle would be president of operations and Jessica would be executive vice president. Major decisions would require unanimous agreement among the 3. It was a structure designed to create gridlock and maintain the status quo. But here's the truly innovative part, Richard continued, his satisfaction evident. "We're bringing in an outside consultant to serve as chief strategy officer. Someone with fresh perspectives who isn't tangled up in family dynamics." The consultant he'd chosen was Bradley Morrison, a 60-year-old former military logistics officer with no experience in commercial distribution, but plenty of confidence in his own expertise. My position as director of operations would report to both Kyle and Bradley, essentially demoting me while bringing in an outsider to do a lesser version of what I'd been doing for years. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to object, to point out the absurdity of hiring an expensive consultant when they had someone who'd already transformed their company. But he just nodded along with his father's plan, occasionally glancing at me with an expression that begged me not to make a scene. That night after we returned home, I gave him an ultimatum. Either he stood up to his family and demanded recognition for my contributions, or I would leave both the company and the marriage. I wasn't asking for charity or nepotism, I was asking for acknowledgement of what I'd already earned. Marcus promised to fix things. He swore he would talk to his father, restructure the organization, ensure I received the position and compensation I deserved. But weeks passed with no change. Bradley Morrison started his first day, immediately dismissing my systems as overly complicated and announcing his plans to implement real military efficiency. Kyle began overriding my operational decision. Jessica hired her sorority sister as deputy HR director, essentially creating a layer between me and any employee matters. I started making my own plans then. If the Brennan family wouldn't recognize my value, I would find others who did. I quietly ramped up my consulting practice, taking on clients who appreciated expertise regardless of whose name was on the door. I began documenting every system, process and innovation I'd created for Brennan Logistics, careful to preserve evidence of my authorship. Most importantly, I started building relationships with their competitors, suppliers and clients, establishing my own reputation in the industry. Marcus, meanwhile, grew increasingly distant. The pressure of his new role, combined with his siblings' power plays and Bradley's aggressive incompetence, left him stressed and short-tempered. He started working late more often, missing dinners, canceling weekend plans. When he was home, he was distracted, constantly checking his phone or lost in thought about company politics. I tried to be supportive, offering solutions to the problems he complained about, but he began dismissing my input. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation," he'd say, as if I hadn't been managing that complexity for years. "Bradley says we need to approach things differently. Kyle thinks the union negotiations require a masculine Jessica believes the company culture needs to reflect more traditional values." The marriage was dying, suffocated by the same dynamics that had erased my professional contributions, but I still believed we could save it if Marcus would just show the backbone he'd promised to develop. I suggested marriage counseling. He said he was too busy. I planned romantic getaways. He canceled them for emergency meetings. I tried to discuss our future. He changed the subject to quarterly projections. Then, 2 weeks ago, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been reviewing our personal finances, preparing for tax season, when I noticed irregularities, transfers from our joint accounts to an unfamiliar investment fund, credit card charges for expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel bookings in Chicago during times when Marcus was supposedly at the warehouse. The amounts were small at first, easy to overlook, but they'd been increasing over the past 3 months. When I confronted Marcus, he had explanations for everything. The investment fund was a retirement planning strategy Bradley had recommended. The dinners were client entertainment that he'd forgotten to expense properly. The hotels were from a logistics conference he'd attended. His answers were smooth, practiced, believable if you wanted to believe them. But I'd spent 5 years watching the Brennan family gaslight me about my own contributions. I recognized the tactics. I hired a forensic accountant, paying from my consulting accounts to investigate our finances. What she found was damn. The investment fund was real, but it was registered in Marcus's name only. The restaurant charges corresponded to dates when I'd been traveling for my consulting work. The hotel bookings included room service for 2, champagne, and late-night checkout fees. My husband wasn't just moving money, he was funding an affair. The accountant also discovered something else. Marcus had been slowly liquidating our joint assets for months, selling stocks from our investment portfolio, closing out CDs early despite the penalty, even pawning jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother, pieces I thought were in our safe deposit box. He'd been converting everything to cash, preparing for something. I considered confronting him immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the years of strategic thinking, or maybe it was just self-preservation, but I decided to wait and gather more information. I installed tracking software on his devices, monitored his communications, and watched him believe he was getting away with whatever he was planning. What I learned over the next week was that Marcus wasn't just having an affair, he was planning to leave me, and he intended to take everything when he went. The other woman was Stephanie Chen, Bradley Morrison's 32-year-old daughter who worked as a consultant in Chicago. They'd met during one of Bradley's strategy sessions, and had been seeing each other for 4 months. Their text messages revealed not just the affair, but Marcus's plans to drain our accounts, file for divorce, and start fresh in Chicago with Stephanie. "He's been embezzling from Brennan Logistics too," Stephanie had written in one message. "Once he gets the last payment from the offshore client, we'll have enough to start our own company. My dad will help us get established. Your wife will be too devastated to fight back, and your family will be too proud to admit they were robbed." The casual cruelty of that message, the assumption that I would simply crumble, ignited something in me. They thought I was weak because I'd accepted marginalization for so long. They thought I was stupid because I'd trusted my husband.
They thought I was helpless because I'd been systematically erased from the success I'd created. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I backed up every piece of evidence about the affair and the financial fraud. I documented every system and process I'd created for Brennan Logistics. I reached out to key clients and suppliers, ostensibly to check on their satisfaction, but really to remind them who had actually been managing their account. Most importantly, I put my own financial safeguards in place, moving my consulting income to accounts Marcus didn't know existed, and securing liquid assets he couldn't access. But I wasn't fast enough. Marcus must have sensed something had changed, or maybe his timeline was always set for that Thursday night. He told me he was working late, preparing for a supplier meeting. The next morning, I pretended to believe him, even packed him a dinner to take to the office. Instead, he went to the bank, used his access to drain every joint account we had, and disappeared into the night. Which brings me to this moment, sitting in my empty bedroom, at 4 a.m., staring at zeroed-out bank accounts, and contemplating my next move. Marcus thought he was leaving me with nothing. He thought I would be too shocked to respond, too proud to admit what had happened, too dependent on him to survive. He thought wrong. What Marcus didn't know, what none of the Brennan family knew, was that I'd been playing a longer game than any of them imagined. While they were busy erasing my contributions and plotting my marginalization, I'd been building something they never saw coming. The woman they dismissed as just Marcus's wife, who helps out sometimes, had been quietly positioning herself to take everything they valued most. The Brennan family thought they understood power because they'd inherited a business their grandfather built. They thought they understood strategy because they'd maintained the status quo for decades. They thought they understood me because they'd successfully minimized me for 5 years. They were about to receive an education in all three. As dawn broke over Milwaukee, painting the sky the pale pink of new beginnings, I opened my laptop and began implementing the plan I'd hoped I'd never have to use. Marcus had stolen our money and fled to Chicago with his mistress. In response, I was going to take something far more valuable. I was going to take Brennan Logistics itself. The first step was already in motion, set in place months ago when I'd seen the writing on the wall. The second step would begin in approximately 4 hours, when Richard Brennan arrived at his office to find a letter that would change everything. The third step would depend on how quickly the Brennan family realized that the woman they'd systematically underestimated had been their greatest threat all along. Marcus thought he was escaping with our savings and starting from. Instead, he'd just fired the opening shot in a war he couldn't possibly win. He'd stolen from the wrong woman, betrayed the wrong wife, and underestimated the wrong opponent. By the time he realized his mistake, it would be far too late to undo the damage.
I closed my laptop and stood up, stretching muscles stiff from sitting in shock. Then I walked to my closet and pulled out my best business suit, the charcoal gray one that made me look like someone who ate corporations for breakfast. Today wasn't a day for mourning the end of my marriage, or lamenting my empty bank accounts. Today was the day I stopped accepting diminishment and started taking what had always been mine. Marcus Brennan thought he'd left me with nothing. He was about to discover that he'd actually set me free. The letter I'd prepared for Richard Brennan had been sitting in my desk drawer for 3 months, updated periodically as new information came to light. Now, as I drove through the empty streets of Milwaukee at 6 a.m., I knew it was time to deliver it. The security guard at Brennan Logistics nodded as I swiped my access card, accustomed to my early arrivals. What he didn't know was that this would be my last time entering the building as director of operations. Richard's office occupied the top-floor corner suite, a testament to old-fashioned executive privilege with its mahogany furniture and walls lined with photos of handshake deals and ribbon cuttings. I placed the envelope squarely in the center of his desk, where he couldn't miss it when he arrived at his customary 8 a.m. Then I went to my own cramped office 2 floors down and began the process of digital extraction. Over the past months, I'd carefully documented every system, process, and innovation I'd created for Brennan Logistics. Not the official company versions that bore Marcus's or Kyle's names, but the real documentation with development notes, timestamps, and digital signatures that proved authorship. I uploaded everything to my private cloud servers, ensuring I had complete records of my intellectual property. At 7:45, I sent a company-wide email from my official account. Subject line: Operational Transition Notice. The message was brief and professional, informing all staff that I would be resigning from my position effective immediately, and that all operational queries should be directed to Kyle Brennan or Bradley Morrison. I didn't mention that neither man understood the systems they'd be inheriting. That would become apparent soon enough. By 8:15, my office was clear of personal items, and I was walking back to my car when my phone exploded with calls. Richard first, then Kyle, then Jessica. I didn't answer any of them. They could read the letter first, then we could talk. The letter was a masterpiece of professional devastation. I'd spent weeks crafting it with the help of my attorney, ensuring every word was legally bulletproof while maximizing impact. It began with a formal resignation, then systematically detailed every innovation I'd brought to Brennan Logistics, complete with performance metrics showing the direct correlation between my initiatives and company growth. The third section outlined the systematic marginalization I'd experienced, using their own emails and meeting minutes as evidence. But it was the final section that would really get their attention. I listed every client relationship I'd personally developed and maintained, every supplier contract I'd negotiated, every key employee I'd hired and trained. Then I noted, with clinical precision, that none of these relationships were contractually obligated to remain with Brennan Logistics after my departure. The implication was clear without being legally actionable as a threat. The company they'd inherited from their grandfather that they'd treated as their birthright was held together by relationships and systems that belonged to me. My phone rang again. This time it was Marcus, calling from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail and listened to the message a few minutes later. Nina, what have you done? My father is losing his mind. He says you've resigned and that you're trying to destroy the company. This is about last night, isn't it? About the money. We can work this out. Just call me back. The casual dismissal of grand theft as the money told me everything I needed to know about Marcus's mindset. He still didn't understand the magnitude of what he'd done or what was coming. I deleted the message and blocked the number. By noon, I was sitting in the conference room of Hartley and Associates, the law firm I'd retained to handle what came next. Samantha Hartley was a corporate attorney who specialized in intellectual property and employment law. She'd made her reputation dismantling companies that had stolen from their employees, and she was practically salivating over my case. This documentation is exceptional, she said, reviewing the files I'd provided. You've established clear ownership of numerous trade secrets and proprietary processes. The fact that Brennan Logistics never had you sign a comprehensive intellectual property assignment agreement is going to be very expensive for them. What's our timeline? I asked. We can file the formal notices this afternoon. Cease and desist on their use of your proprietary systems, demand for compensation, and notice of intent to compete. Given that you've resigned, any non-compete clauses in your original employment agreement are likely unenforceable, especially since they've been systematically denying you credit for your work. And Marcus's embezzlement from the company? Samantha smiled. That's where it gets interesting. As his spouse, you have certain protections regarding marital assets, but his theft from Brennan Logistics is a criminal matter. If we time this correctly, we can use that leverage to ensure they don't fight your other claim. The meeting lasted 3 hours, mapping out a strategy that would systematically dismantle every advantage the Brennan family thought they had. By the time I left, formal legal notices were being prepared, and a forensic audit of Brennan Logistics was being quietly initiated through channels Samantha had cultivated over years of practice. That evening, I met with Chen Wei, owner of Stellar Distribution Networks, Brennan Logistics' biggest competitor. We'd known each other professionally for years, and he'd often tried to recruit me. Now, sitting in his office overlooking Lake Michigan, I was ready to listen. I heard about your resignation, he said without preamble. Also heard that Marcus has disappeared, and the Brennan family is in crisis mode. I assume these events are connected. I smiled. Let's just say I'm exploring new opportunities. I understand you're looking to expand into the Milwaukee market. We've been trying for years, but Brennan has the infrastructure and relationships locked down. Without inside knowledge of their operations and client needs, it's been impossible to make inroads. What if I told you that could change? What if someone with intimate knowledge of every Brennan client, every inefficiency in their system, every weakness in their operation, was willing to help you compete? Chen leaned forward, his interest evident. That someone would be very valuable to us. What are you proposing? A partnership, not employment, but a joint venture. I bring the operational expertise and client relationships. You bring the capital and infrastructure. Together, we create a new entity that makes Brennan Logistics obsolete within 18 months. We negotiated for 2 hours, hammering out the framework for what would become Midwest Integrated Solutions. Chen would provide the initial funding and warehouse facilities. I would contribute my intellectual property, industry relationships, and operational expertise. We'd split ownership 60-40 in his favor initially, with provisions for me to increase my stake based on performance metrics. Most importantly, I'd have complete operational autonomy, something I'd never had at Brennan, despite creating their entire modern infrastructure. The next morning, Richard Brennan called me personally. His voice was a mixture of rage and panic that I'd never heard before. "Nina, this is insane. You can't just walk away and threaten to destroy everything we've built." "Everything you built?" I replied calmly. "Richard, I have 5 years of documentation showing that I built your modern operation. You just took credit for it." "That's not. We've always acknowledged your contributions." "Really? Should I forward you the press releases where Marcus is credited with innovations I developed? The board presentations where Kyle claimed my strategies as his own? The award ceremonies where Jessica accepted recognition for my programs?" Silence on the line. "Then, those are just public relations necessities. You know how important family image is to our business. And that's exactly why your business is about to face serious challenges. You prioritized image over competence. You chose nepotism over merit. Now you'll deal with the consequences. What do you want? Money? A better position? We can renegotiate your role. I want what I've always wanted. Richard. Recognition for what I've built, and fair compensation for my contributions. But it's too late for that now. Your son stole from me, and your family spent years stealing credit for my work. Now I'm going to build something better without you. You signed agreements, non-compete, confidentiality clauses, all of which became void when Marcus committed embezzlement and when you collectively engaged in intellectual property theft. My attorney will be in touch." I hung up before he could respond. The war had officially begun. Over the next week, the Brennan empire began showing cracks. Without me managing daily operations, small problems cascaded into major crises. Kyle couldn't figure out the routing optimization software and reverted to manual scheduling, causing delays and overtime costs. Bradley Morrison's military approach to inventory management clashed with union regulations, leading to worker complaints and threatened strikes. Jessica's HR department struggled to answer technical questions from employees about systems I'd implemented. But the real blow came when 3 major clients called me directly, bypassing Brennan altogether. They'd received illegal notices about intellectual property disputes and were concerned about service continuity. I assured them that Midwest Integrated Solutions would be operational within 60 days and would honor all existing contracts with improved terms. By the end of the week, commitment letters were being drafted. Marcus finally surfaced 10 days after his disappearance, not with a phone call but through a divorce attorney. The paperwork was almost insultingly simple. He wanted a quick, clean dissolution of marriage. He'd keep what he'd taken, I'd keep what was left, and we'd go our separate ways. His attorney seemed confident this was a generous offer given that Marcus had already secured the liquid assets. I had Samantha respond with our counteroffer. Marcus could keep the money he'd stolen from our personal accounts, but he'd return every penny taken from Brennan Logistics or face criminal prosecution. Furthermore, he'd sign over any claim to intellectual property developed during our marriage, and provide a sworn affidavit about his family's systematic appropriation of my work. In exchange, I'd agree to the divorce and not pursue criminal charges for the personal theft. The response was predictable: outrage, accusations of extortion, threats of prolonged litigation. But I knew Marcus's position was weak. Stephanie Chen might be supporting him temporarily, but she wasn't going to fund a lengthy legal battle. And the forensic audit of Brennan Logistics had already uncovered enough embezzlement to put him in prison for several years. While the lawyers negotiated, I focused on building. Chen Wei had moved quickly to secure warehouse space in strategic locations around Milwaukee. I hired away 6 key Brennan employees, all people I'd originally recruited and trained who were frustrated with the family's management style. We offered them equity stakes in the new company, something the Brennans would never have considered for non-family members. The real coup came when I reached out to Diana Morrison, Bradley's ex-wife. She'd been CFO of a major logistics firm before their divorce derailed her career, and she had very specific opinions about her ex-husband's competence. Over coffee, she shared insights about Bradley's weaknesses and revealed that Stephanie had been planning to leave Marcus once she'd extracted enough money to start her own consulting firm. He's a means to an end for her, Diana explained. She learned from her father how to identify weak men with access to resources. Marcus was perfect, insecure about his position, desperate to prove himself, and careless with company funds. She probably started planning her exit the moment he began embezzling. I filed that information away, knowing it would be useful when Marcus realized he'd destroyed his marriage and career for someone who was using him. But personal vindication was less important than professional victory. Diana agreed to join Midwest Integrated Solutions as CFO, bringing her expertise and network to our growing operation. The Brennan family's next move was predictable but poorly executed. They hired a crisis management firm to control the narrative, painting me as a disgruntled employee trying to sabotage a family business out of spite. The press release emphasized their generations of service to the Milwaukee business community, and portrayed my actions as a vindictive response to personal marital problems. I responded by releasing 5 years of performance data showing the direct correlation between my innovations and Brennan's growth. Every metric told the same story: stagnation before my arrival, dramatic improvement during my tenure, and emerging chaos after my departure. I didn't need to make accusations or emotional appeals. The numbers spoke for themselves. Local business journalists, always hungry for a scandal involving established families, began digging deep. They discovered the intellectual property disputes, the questions about ownership of key innovations, and the suspicious timing of Marcus's disappearance. One particularly enterprising reporter even uncovered the connection between Bradley Morrison and Stephanie Chen, adding another layer of scandal to the story. Richard tried one more direct approach, showing up at my temporary office unannounced. He looked older than his 63 years, the stress of the past weeks evident in his hollow eyes and trembling hands. "Nina, please, let's discuss this rationally. You're destroying a legacy, generations of work." "I'm not destroying anything, Richard. I'm competing." "Isn't that what you always said business was about? Free market principles, may the best company win." "This is different. This is personal. You're using inside knowledge to target our clients, our employees." "You mean the clients I developed relationships with, the employees I hired and trained, the systems I created?" "Yes, I'm leveraging my professional assets, just like any entrepreneur would." He slumped in the chair across from my desk, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "What would it take to make this stop?" "Full recognition of my contributions to Brennan Logistics, public acknowledgement of intellectual property ownership, financial compensation for 5 years of undervalued work, and Marcus returns what he stole from the company." That's impossible. The publicity alone would destroy our reputation." "Your reputation is already crumbling, Richard. Kyle can't run operations. Bradley is alienating your workforce. Jessica is hemorrhaging talent. And your son is a thief who abandoned his position to flee with his mistress. I'm offering you a chance to control the narrative rather than letting it control you." He left without agreeing to anything, but I could see the wheels turning. The old man was finally realizing that the family-first philosophy he'd lived by had become a liability. His children weren't capable of running the empire he'd built, and the woman he'd allowed them to marginalize had been the only thing holding it together. 2 days later, Marcus crashed, facing criminal charges, abandoned by Stephanie, who'd already moved on to her next mark, and cut off from family support. He agreed to our terms. He'd return the embezzled funds, sign the affidavits, and disappear from Milwaukee permanently. The divorce would be finalized within 30 days. It was a complete capitulation, delivered through his attorney with no personal contact. I thought I'd feel something more when I signed the papers. Sadness for the end of a marriage that had once held promise, anger at the betrayal and abandonment, even satisfaction at winning the legal battle. Instead, I felt only relief and a curious lightness. Marcus had been an anchor disguised as a partner, dragging me down while convincing me he was lifting me up. Now I was free to rise on my own. The real victory came the following week, when Preston Manufacturing, Brennan's largest client, formally notified them of plans to transition their contract to Midwest Integrated Solution. The letter cited concerns about operational instability and leadership changes at Brennan, coupled with confidence in the proven track record of the MLS management team. It was corporate speak for "we're following Nina, because she's the one who actually knows what she's doing." Kyle called me that night, drunk and belligerent. "You've destroyed us," he slurred. 40 years of family business, gone because you couldn't accept your place. I accepted my place for 5 years, Kyle. I accepted being erased, diminished, and undermined while I built your success. Now I'm accepting my actual place as your competitor, and I'm winning. This isn't over. We'll sue, we'll fight, we'll destroy your new company. With what resources? Your clients are leaving, your employees are job hunting. Your cash flow is hemorrhaging because you can't manage the operations I designed. Face it, Kyle, you're not losing because I'm vindictive. You're losing because you're incompetent. He hung up, but I knew the truth had hit home. The Brennan siblings had coasted on inherited privilege and stolen valor for so long that they'd never developed actual skills. Now faced with real competition from someone who understood their business better than they did, they were collapsing. The industry watched with fascination as David fought Goliath, except in this case, David had insider knowledge of exactly where to place the stones. Within 6 weeks of launching, Midwest Integrated Solutions had secured 40% of Brennan's client base. Our operational metrics were superior across the board: faster delivery times, lower error rates, better customer service scores. We offered employee profit sharing, something the family-owned Brennan would never consider, and attracted top talent from across the industry. Chinwei was ecstatic with the returns on his investment. "You've accomplished more in 2 months than I thought possible in 2 years, he told me during a strategy meeting. "At this rate, we'll be the dominant regional player by next summer." "That's the minimum goal," I replied, spreading out plans for Phase 2 expansion. "Brennan Logistics still has infrastructure we can't match, but they also have debt they can't service without revenue. I project they'll be looking for a buyer within 8 months. You want to acquire them?" Chin asked, eyebrows raised. "I want to offer to acquire them, at a price that reflects their actual value without the systems and relationships I built." Richard Brennan started that company with his father's loan and built it into a regional player. "I'll offer him enough to retire with dignity, but not enough to maintain the family dynasty." "That's coldly brilliant. It's business, something the Brennan family never understood. They thought business was about last names and corner offices. It's actually about competence and value creation. They confused inheritance with achievement. Now they're learning the difference." The meeting ended with approval for aggressive expansion plans and a timeline for potential acquisition offers. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey from that dark morning when I discovered our emptied bank accounts to this moment of strategic triumph. Marcus had thought he was taking everything from me. Instead, he'd freed me from the last chains holding me back. The house felt different now that I lived there alone. I'd redecorated, removing all traces of Marcus and the life we'd built on a foundation of lies. The walls that once held photos of Brennan family gatherings now displayed my degrees, professional certifications and awards that finally bore my name alone. The home office that Marcus had claimed as his domain was now my strategic command center, with multiple monitors tracking MES operations and competitor movements. I poured a glass of wine and stood on the deck, looking out over the city light. Somewhere out there, Richard Brennan was probably sitting in his study, wondering how his empire had crumbled so quickly. Kyle was likely drowning his incompetence in alcohol. Jessica was probably updating her resume,
And Marcus was discovering that running away with stolen money wasn't the same as building something real. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana Morrison. Just heard through the grapevine that Bradley submitted his resignation. Apparently, he couldn't handle the pressure when the employees started openly questioning his decision.
Also, Stephanie Chen has been spotted in Dallas with a new target. Seems she's moved on to greener pastures. I smiled at the poetic justice. Everyone who'd participated in my marginalization was facing their own downfall, not because I'd orchestrated some elaborate revenge, but because they'd built their success on stolen foundations. Without me propping them up, they were revealed as the hollow figures they'd always been. Another text, this one from Samantha Hartley. Brennan's attorneys have reached out. They're willing to discuss a comprehensive settlement. Seems the forensic audit found more embezzlement than just Marcus's. The whole family has been treating company funds as personal piggy banks for years. They need this to go away quietly. I considered the implication. A settlement would mean giving up some leverage, but it would also mean avoiding prolonged litigation that could distract from building Aeneas. More importantly, it would force the Brennan family to formally acknowledge my contributions and compensate me for years of theft. The money would be nice, but the vindication would be priceless. Schedule the meeting, I replied. Let's see what they're offering. As midnight approached, I made one final check of the Aeneas operational dashboard. All systems running smoothly, deliveries on schedule, customer satisfaction metrics exceeding targets. Employee morale high. Everything I'd built at Brennan, but better because I had real authority and ownership. The empty bank accounts that had started this journey were already a distant memory. My consulting work alone had more than replaced the stolen funds, and my equity in Aeneas was worth far more than Marcus could have imagined when he was planning his escape. He'd thought he was leaving me with nothing. Instead, he'd given me the push I needed to claim everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Brennan family would make their settlement offer. Clients would need attention. Expansion plans would require refinement. The business of building a logistics empire would continue, but tonight I raised my glass to the empty sky and toasted the woman I'd become. The woman who'd refused to accept diminishment. The woman who'd built her success on competence rather than connection. The woman who'd taken the worst betrayal of her life and transformed it into the greatest opportunity. Marcus had drained our bank accounts and fled with his mistress. In response, I'd taken his family's business and built something better. It wasn't revenge, exactly. It was and it was only the beginning. The conference room at Hartley & Associates had been carefully chosen for psychological impact. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Milwaukee skyline, with Brennan Logistics' aging headquarters visible in the distance, a reminder of how far they'd fallen while I'd risen. The Brennan family filed in like defendants approaching sentencing. Richard looking every day of his 63 years. Kyle barely concealing his hostility. Jessica clutching her portfolio like armor. And Diane maintaining the rigid posture of someone determined not to show weakness. Marcus wasn't there. Of course, he'd already signed his agreements and disappeared to whatever hole Stephanie Chen had left him in when she moved on to her next mark. His absence spoke louder than any words about how completely he'd failed as both a husband and an heir apparent. "Thank you all for coming," Samantha began, her tone professionally neutral. "As we discussed, this meeting is to explore a comprehensive settlement that addresses the various claims between my client and Brennan Logistics." Richard cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I want to state for the record that we dispute many of these claims. The idea that Nina owns intellectual property developed while employed by our company is thoroughly documented and legally sound." Samantha interrupted smoothly. "We have 5 years of development notes, timestamps and digital signatures proving Ms. Reeves created these systems before and outside of her official employment duties. Your failure to secure proper IP assignment agreements is not her problem." Kyle couldn't contain himself. "She was my brother's wife. Everything she did was for the family business." "Interesting perspective," I said, speaking for the first time. Was I working for the family business when I spent nights and weekends developing systems you claimed as your own? Was I working for the family when I used my personal funds to attend conferences where I recruited your best clients? Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Nina, we've always appreciated your contributions. Appreciated. I pulled out a folder of press clippings. This article credits you with developing our employee retention program. This one thanks Kyle for revolutionizing our fleet management. This one praises Marcus for his visionary leadership in modernizing operations. Would you like me to continue? The room fell silent. Even their attorneys looked uncomfortable as the evidence of systematic credit theft piled up on the conference table. What do you want? Diane finally asked, her first words of the meeting. I want fair compensation for 5 years of undervalued work. I want public acknowledgement of my contributions. I want the return of all funds Marcus embezzled, not just from me but from the company. And I want a clear separation that allows me to compete freely without legal harassment. The number you're suggesting for compensation is absurd, Richard said. It would bankrupt us. No, I replied. Your mismanagement is what's bankrupting you. Losing 40% of your clients in 2 months is what's bankrupting you. Having to hire 3 people to poorly replicate what I did alone is what's bankrupting you. I'm simply asking for what I should have been paid if you'd valued competence over chromosomes. The negotiation stretched for hours. They tried to lowball. I countered with more evidence. They threatened litigation. I reminded them of the criminal charges still pending regarding company embezzlement. They appealed to history and legacy. I pointed to their current operational failures. Finally, as afternoon faded to evening, we reached an agreement. Brennan Logistics would pay me $2.8 million over 3 years, acknowledging it as deferred compensation for innovations and management. They would issue a public statement recognizing my role in the company's modernization. All non-compete and confidentiality agreements would be voided. In exchange, I would drop all claims and agree not to pursue criminal charges related to the family's financial irregularities. Kyle signed the papers like he was signing his own death warrant. Jessica's hands shook as she added her signature. Diane maintained her composure until the end. But it was Richard who surprised me. As the others filed out, he lingered. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Not just for the business matters, but for how we treated you as family. You gave us everything, and we gave you nothing but disrespect in return. I studied his face, searching for manipulation but finding only exhaustion and regret. Apologies don't change the past, Richard. No, but they might influence the future. He pulled out an envelope. This isn't part of the settlement, it's personal. From Marcus. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Whatever Marcus has to say, it's too late. I know, but he wanted you to have it anyway. Said it was important you know the truth about Chicago. After he left, I sat alone in the conference room, holding Marcus's letter. Part of me wanted to tear it up unread, to deny him even this small connection. But curiosity won. I opened the envelope and read his cramped handwriting. Nina, by the time you read this, everything will be over. The divorce, the settlements, the complete destruction of what we built together. I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but I need you to know that Chicago wasn't what it seemed. Yes, I was having an affair. Yes, I stole money. Yes, I was planning to leave, but not for the reasons you think. Stephanie Chen approached me 4 months ago with evidence that my family had been embezzling from Brennan Logistics for years. Not just skimming but systematic theft that would have destroyed the company if exposed. She offered to help me escape before the scandal broke, to start fresh with enough money to build something new. I thought I was saving myself from being dragged down with them. I realize now that she was playing me from the beginning. Her father probably discovered the embezzlement during his operational review, and they decided to use it for their own ends. By the time I understood the manipulation, I was already in too deep. The money I took was my attempt to secure a future I thought was crumbling anyway. This doesn't excuse what I did to you. Nothing could. You deserved a partner who would stand up for you, fight for you, recognize your brilliance instead of letting my family diminish it. Instead, I was weak, cowardly and ultimately criminal. You built our success and I let others take credit. You saved my family's company and I let them erase you. You loved me and I betrayed you in every possible way. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand how I became someone capable of such deception. The therapist says I was trained from birth to value family loyalty over personal integrity, to see wives as supporters rather than equals, to believe that masculine pride mattered more than feminine accomplishment. It's not an excuse, just an explanation for how I could have been so blind to what I was doing to you. I hope Midwest Integrated Solutions destroys Brennan Logistics. I hope you build an empire that makes my family's company look like the amateur operation it always was without you. I hope you find someone who sees your worth and never lets anyone diminish it. Most of all, I hope someday you can forgive yourself for loving someone as unworthy as me, because that's the only forgiveness that matters. Marcus, I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my briefcase. It didn't change anything, but it did provide closure. Marcus hadn't been an evil mastermind executing a careful plan. He'd been a weak man manipulated by stronger personalities, just as he'd allowed his family to manipulate him into erasing my contributions. In trying to escape one trap, he'd fallen into another, destroying everything in the process. The next morning, I arrived at Minas headquarters to find a celebration in progress. We'd just landed 3 more major contracts, including one with a national retailer looking to improve their regional distribution. Chen Wei was practically dancing as he showed me the projected revenue number. At this rate, we'll need to expand again within 6 months, he said. I'm thinking acquisition might be faster than building from scratch. I smiled. Funny you should mention that. I have reason to believe Brennan Logistics might be receptive to offers soon. You want to buy them? After everything, I want to buy their infrastructure, their warehouses, their trucks, their remaining contracts, stripped of the family management that made it inefficient. Those assets could be valuable. Plus, there's poetic justice in transforming their legacy into part of our success. The next few months passed in a blur of growth and expansion. Minas hired aggressively, implemented new technologies, and established partnerships that Brennan never could have imagined. We became known not just for operational excellence, but for progressive policies, profit sharing, flexible scheduling, advancement based on merit rather than connections. Everything Brennan Logistics should have been if they'd valued competence over bloodline. The settlement payments arrived on schedule, each check a reminder of what my innovations had been worth all along. I used the money to increase my equity stake in NS, invest in other startups led by undervalued women in logistics, and establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students studying supply chain management, building something positive from the ashes of betrayal. Marcus's predictions about Brennan Logistics proved accurate. Without me managing operations, and with their cash flow crippled by client defections, they struggled to meet obligations. Kyle's attempts at cost-cutting led to service failures that drove away more customers. Jessica's HR policies caused an employee exodus. Bradley Morrison's consulting fees drained resources without providing value. Within 8 months, they were hemorrhaging money and facing bankruptcy. Richard called me on a cold February morning, his voice stripped of the authority it once carried. Nina, I need to discuss something with you. In confidence, I agreed to meet him, not in my office but at a neutral location. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the past year, the weight of failure etched in every line of his face. We're finished, he said without preamble. The bank is calling in loans. We can't meet payroll next month. My children have proven incapable of running the business without you. I waited, saying nothing. This wasn't a time for false sympathy or cruel satisfaction. I've had an offer from Stellar Distribution, he continued. Chinwei's other company. They'd take on our debt in exchange for our assets. It would be dissolution rather than acquisition. The Brennan name would disappear. And you're telling me this because I know Chin is your partner in NS. I know any deal would ultimately benefit you. And despite everything, I'd rather see our infrastructure in your hands than scattered to the winds. I studied him carefully. You're asking me to convince Chin to make a better offer. I'm asking you to consider that 40 years of history might be worth preserving,
even if the family name isn't attached. Our employees don't deserve to suffer for our failures. Our remaining clients need continuity. The community we've served deserves better than liquidation. He was right, though it galled him to admit it. The employees who'd stayed loyal to Brennan weren't responsible for the family's mismanagement. The clients who'd remained deserved seamless service. And strategically acquiring Brennan's infrastructure intact would accelerate NS's growth significantly. I'll discuss it with Chin, I said finally, but any deal would be contingent on complete operational control. No family involvement, no advisory roles, no ceremonial position. You'd walk away with enough to retire comfortably, but the Brennan legacy in logistics would end. His shoulders sagged with defeat and relief. I understand. It's more than we deserve. The acquisition negotiations took 2 months. Chen and I structured a deal that absorbed Brennan's viable assets into NS, while providing enough funds to settle their debts and give the family a modest retirement cushion. Richard signed over 40 years of business building with hands that shook only slightly. Kyle and Jessica didn't even attend the final signing. On April 1st, exactly 1 year after Marcus had drained our bank accounts and fled, I stood in what had been Richard Brennan's corner office. The mahogany furniture was gone, replaced with modern workstation. The wall of glory photos had been removed, making room for digital displays showing real-time operational metrics. The transformation was complete. Diana Morrison knocked and entered, carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "Congratulations, Madam CEO. NS now controls 70% of regional distribution capacity. We're the largest logistics operator in the state. It's just the beginning," I said, accepting a glass. "We have the infrastructure. Now we innovate beyond anything this industry has seen." We toasted to the future, but my mind drifted to the past. A year ago, I'd been a marginalized wife in a failing marriage, erased from my own success story, and robbed of my financial security. Now I stood at the helm of a logistics empire, recognized for my abilities and compensated for my worth. The transformation hadn't been planned, but it had been necessary. That evening, I hosted a dinner for key NS employees at my home. The house that had once felt empty now buzzed with energy and purpose. We talked about expansion plans, new technologies, and the culture we were building together. No one mentioned the Brennan name or the drama of the past year. We were focused on the future, not the past. As the evening wound down, Justin Chen, one of the managers I'd hired away from Brennan, pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "not just for the opportunity here, but for showing us what real leadership looks like. At Brennan, we were always told to stay in our lanes, know our places. Here, you've shown us that competence matters more than connections. Everyone has something valuable to contribute," I replied. "The trick is creating an environment where those contributions are recognized and rewarded. That's all I've done." After everyone left, I stood on my deck once again, looking out over the Milwaukee skyline. The Brennan Logistics sign that had once blazed from their headquarters was dark, soon to be replaced with the NS logo. Marcus was somewhere in California, last I'd heard, working in middle management for a company that didn't know his history. The Brennan siblings had scattered to pursue other interests, their dreams of corporate dynasty shattered. Richard and Diane had retired to Florida, far from the scene of their empire's collapse. But I was still here, still building, still growing. The bank accounts Marcus had emptied were now fuller than ever. The credit he'd stolen had been reclaimed with interest. The future he'd tried to deny me had arrived, more magnificent than anything I could have imagined when I was accepting diminishment as the price of partnership. My phone buzzed with a message from Chen Wei. "Investment group from Chicago wants to meet next week. They're interested in partnering for national expansion." This could be huge. I smiled and typed back, "Schedule it. We're just getting started." As midnight approached, I raised a final toast to the journey that had brought me here. Marcus had thought he was taking everything when he emptied our accounts and fled. Instead, he'd given me the push I needed to stop accepting less than I deserved. He'd freed me from the chains of a marriage built on deception and a professional role defined by others' limitations. In trying to destroy me, he'd created the circumstances for my transformation. The woman who'd awakened to find her bank accounts emptied had rebuilt herself into someone who would never again allow others to define her worth. The company that had erased her contributions now existed only as absorbed assets in her growing empire. The family that had marginalized her had learned too late that competence couldn't be claimed through birthright or stolen through proximity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. National expansion would require different strategies than regional dominance. New competitors would emerge. New obstacles would arise. But tonight, in the quiet satisfaction of justice served and potential realized, I allowed myself to savor the victory, not just over those who'd wronged me, but over the part of myself that had accepted being wronged for so long. Marcus had emptied our bank accounts before leaving. In response, I'd taken his family's business and built something they could never have imagined. It wasn't revenge, it was revelation. A demonstration of what becomes possible when someone stops accepting diminishment and starts demanding recognition. The bank accounts were just money. What I'd gained was infinitely more valuable. The knowledge that I'd never again settle for less than I deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.